If you've ever spent any sort of time out in the west deserts of America, or in fact of Arizona, you may have come across these strange letters up in the mountains that are painted in all white. Usually, if you pay attention close enough, these letters are the same first letter of the town's name. Now, this is not by accident. The one you see behind me here is the Prescott P. Now, we're on top of Badger Mountain, smack dab in the middle of Prescott Valley, Arizona. Now, I'm going to explain to you why it is that these are here and why they're still important today. My name is Archer Ford. I make tutorials about standard definition audio and video equipment, as well as documentaries on outdated historical concepts that pioneered the world that we live in today. If you like the look of the 1990s, then you bumped into the right idiot. In the late 1910s and early 1920s, when air travel was starting to mature, there was no such thing as ground-based navigation aids or computerized instruments or even analog instruments to help us navigate. GPS was, of course, a good 80 years in the future, so that wasn't going to help anybody. Maps were available, but they were very crude. There were really only two different ways that you could navigate when you were traveling long distance in aircraft back in the 20s. On your maps, you would typically have these sections that were marked in distance and then connected via pointing arrows. These arrows were physical, concrete, painted arrows in the ground. And these were what you used during the daytime for you to reference if you were going in the right direction. Sounds a little sketchy, because it was. Not really knowing where you were going in a day when aviation, if you made one small mistake, had left you stranded in the middle of nowhere, is just a little bit frightening. But if you somehow did manage to follow these correctly and you got to where you wanted to go, these would tell you if you got to the right town. The lettering itself is about 50 by 50, at least for the round portion of the P. The actual stem is roughly about 100 feet long. Now, just throughout Arizona alone, there are many of these little markers. Another few examples besides Prescott and the one behind me is Kingman and Jerome. Now, if you're familiar with Jerome, it is a town built into the mountainside next to an old mine. There's not an airport next to it, but these are still very useful for navigational aids. They're still used moderately today, but mainly as a teaching method of old for pilots who may not be too confident in their skills yet or just want to find a piece of history laying around. You'll notice that the one behind me is put on an extreme down slope. Now, this is on purpose. If this was flat, it would be a bit more difficult to read. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing if you're in a flat town, say Winslow, Arizona. But when you're in a town where there's many different mountains and hills, such as Prescott or Jerome, it can be a little bit more difficult to see if you're looking for something flat on the ground. Putting something up on a mountain like this and making it 50 some odd feet across in stark contrast in color to its surroundings makes it much easier to see. Now, to prove my point on where we are, we're currently sitting on the top of Badger Mountain. Now, as far as I know, this P has been at this particular spot for pretty much its entire life, which again could have been all the way up to 100 years ago. Behind my cameraman here is an old Verizon tower, which is indeed still in use. Now, this tower is useful because line of sight and umbrella coverage is obviously what you want as a cellular network. But it being next to the P proves my point, because you want something as high up as can visibly be seen from as far away as possible. Though, if I'm being honest, I'm gonna admit to being a little bit confused because this particular sign is pointed directly west. Now, that doesn't sound like a bad thing at first, especially when you consider that most air traffic now and former came from the east and west. But you can't really see this if you're coming in from the east. You have to be in the middle of Prescott or Prescott Valley and know where to look to find this one. You really got to know where you're looking or take a pretty good educated guess based on the town you think you're in order to find it. It's kind of a stark contrast for this telling you where it is rather than confirming where you are. The other weird thing about this is Prescott Airport is way over there, completely perpendicular to where this particular sign is. Not to mention, it's about 5 miles as the crow flies away. That's not so bad when you're in an airplane, but you don't really want to be in a small airplane around here. It's high altitude. There's not a lot of performance on your smaller engines. You can't really turn out just in case you get trapped. All to find a sign doesn't make too much sense. Moreover, in here, where it's mostly hilly, is a complete difference in contrast to where the airport is, which is completely flat. So if you're looking for a runway in here, as may be relatively evident, you're not going to find one. Now, what I will give this particular sign in terms of its location is it is smack dab in the middle of the city. So just in case you're a driver in the middle of Prescott and you really don't know where you are, just look for the P. That's a joke. The other thing that you probably don't know is just how steep this really is. And it is quite treacherous if you're not paying attention. This is probably, if I'm looking dead straight, easily a 35-degree angle, if not more. I'm not quite sure how people paint this. There's a bucket over there, which if I were to venture to guess, they just simply fill with paint and dump all over the place. What's really funny about that bucket is it's your classic Home Depot bucket, and it's very orange. In fact, on the trail down there, you can see where we came in. That's close enough to where you can actually make out that bucket, and it doesn't take too much of an intuitive mind to figure out what's up here. So, while a very interesting form of navigation aid in today's world, it's mainly more of a fun treat you get to see every now and then. Next, we're going to talk about VORs, and those are much more useful. So, VORs, what are they? Well, if you've ever wandered around the deserts or flatlands out in the west, you probably would have seen these things. The giant, upside down, white ice cream cones with looks like a beer can up top. This is a VOR. VOR stands for Very High Frequency Omnidirectional Range. So what this is a beacon station. This station spins 360 degrees around and lets the pilots know where they are in relative direction to it. Some of them, like this, most of them these days, also have DME, which is distance measuring equipment. DME is basically saying, all right, you're on this radial from it, but you're also this far from it. Very useful for calculations in fuel and all sorts of other important things that pilots have to deal with. Generally speaking, these are placed in the middle of nowhere. However, this one seems to be in the center of a farming community. What happens in cases like this is farmers will lease the land to the government so that they have an access road and a place to actually put the VORs. Nobody ever really comes out here except to service these. Sadly, even these are starting to get replaced as the last piece of analog navigation equipment that pilots use these days. There used to be thousands upon thousands of these in a navigational network placed all across the United States, and the way that we would navigate is by what's known as VOR hopping. So you'd go from one, get about halfway to the other, switch the frequencies, and continue on to the next point. For 50 to 70 years, this is how we did this. Nowadays, GPS has pretty much replaced this idea entirely, and VORs are a bit of a relic. Now, there is one exception to this. They are used in what's called an MON network, Minimum Operational Network, and these are highlighted in green on your low and high charts. What this does is gives an emergency navigation system in case things like GPS fails or an outage is created, because GPS is not always reliable. You have to have a minimum of 3 satellites to get a good triangulation, and 5 if you're going to have any sort of advanced navigation. What's weird and peculiar about this particular VOR is, well, just how close I can get to it. This is weird. I've never stood this close to one of these things. Feels very much like I shouldn't be here, but this is still a public access road. This is Wichita VOR, ICT, if you're looking at a map. If you've ever spent any time in Wichita or Kansas in general, you'll know that the joke is that this is one of the flattest states in the entire country. So, why is this here? If you look around, somehow this is on a hill. I can actually see about 10 miles away. Now, the idea of this is absolutely hilarious because, again, flat estate, you didn't think this would be here. This is about half an hour outside of town and all the different airports. Wichita is the aviation capital of the entire country. Now, you wouldn't think that with Boeing's manufacturing plant being in Seattle, but they also do have a main branch down here as well. When this one got put here, I'm not sure, but it is still very odd that it's so far away. The older brother to the VOR that was far less sophisticated was an NDB station, or a non-directional beacon. And these were groundbreaking for the time and they were extraordinarily useful. But the issue with them is they were so primitive that sometimes, even simply due to wind drift, you would never find them unless you knew exactly how to trace their location, even with the beacon saying where you are. And look, I found one. I never thought I would see one of these up close. So you can tell it's an NDB for two reasons, really. One, doesn't look like anything. You could pass right by this thing and you would never guess what it was. The second way is by the antenna style itself. That's pretty much what they all look like. I can't really describe what kind of antenna it is. I'm not great with antenna styles, never have been, but that's an NDB. This is Peach, I think it's called. Weird name. Might be Peak. I don't know. Spelled P-I-C-H-E. You can come see this thing in the middle of nowhere, Wichita, and I don't think it's even Wichita. I'm so far out of town, but that's it. Yeah, its code is IC. Now that I think about it, these things are powerful enough and old enough, and that tape is magnetic enough, you might actually be able to hear it. I didn't think about that, but that might be the case for the VOR too. I've stood close enough to cell towers where this thing caught the signal. Huh. I'll check that out later. Yeah, the basic idea and structure of an NDB is simple. Inside this box is nothing more than an AM low frequency generator and an amplifier. The signal goes up through the tower and then everywhere. Jets like that one used to rely on these sorts of NAVAIDS all the time. They're so primitive, however, that even if you have one, you really don't want to use it. Now, if I was one of those guys, I would not want to be relying on this thing. There's a lot of different errors that you can come across when trying to use these things as navigation aids. Sometimes they're so bad, depending on where you are, that it's almost better to use dead reckoning, which is just, hey, there's a thing on the ground that's on my map. That's where I am. You're not seeing this from the air, at least not from 10,000 feet. What's so advanced about a VOR, or at least it was at the time, is that they project directly on a beacon that you can tune to. So that means if I'm pointing straight this way on a radial of out of 360 degrees, take, I don't know, 352 degrees, you can intercept the specific 352 radial, and you can fly direct to this station. NDBs can't do that. They really just emit a signal that's there, and you have a little dial in the cockpit that shows, hey, I'm this direction. That's it. That's all you get. So it's rather interesting that these are the last of the analog ground-based navigation aids. They're fun, they're cool. I use them when I can, just because I think they're a cool piece of history that's still useful, but not as reliable anymore with the redundancy of GPS. It's sadly not quite the same as it used to be, as much as I wish that was not the case. So it's cool to see one that's this close in person. So I hope you enjoyed this rabbit hole between going down the letters on the side of the mountains to a very brief touch on NDBs to a very rare and up-close look at VORs. This is how pilots navigate. The chances that you have actually run into one are pretty high. They're frequently placed on the sides of interstates because they're easier to get to. You don't have to go into the middle of nowhere where vehicles and maintenance crews are less likely to be able to get to them easy. Stuff like this is easier. But yes, I hope you've enjoyed it. Next time we're going to talk about long lines, and that is a completely different subject.